Back when I was growing up in the 80s, I had two passions: Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal, both of which enjoyed a very strange reputation. See, back in the mid-80s, we had a cultural phenomenon in North America called the Satanic Panic. It started when a toddler told a disturbing story to their parents. It was entirely made up, but at the time the parents, filling in a few of the details themselves, concluded that their child had been molested by a satanic cult running a daycare center, and reported it to the police, who, eager to bust wide open some bizarre case, happily took the child's word for it, arrested a bunch of people, and even though they didn't find evidence, this started a media storm, including people coming out of the woodwork who claimed to have been victims of this abuse for 30 or 40 years. Bizarre and terrifying stories that were surprisingly all very similar, because they're surprisingly all derivative of one or two horror movies, started surfacing everywhere. And people were brought to trial. Lives were ruined over this. And, you know, despite the fact that there was absolutely no evidence, once books like Melissa Remembers got into publication, and shows like Unsolved Mysteries started doing very elaborate, in-depth features on it, it stayed in our public consciousness. And even once all the trials were over, there was a huge contingent in our culture that was dedicated to stamping out the satanic influence on American culture. And so what did they focus on when they couldn't find armies of child-abusing, psychotic Satanists running daycare centers? Well, anything that smacked of it, namely heavy metal and Dungeons and Dragons. Now, neither of those hobbies are satanic. Now, Dungeons and Dragons is about telling good fantasy stories, and any story that depicts a clash between good and evil is only as good as its villain, which means you need to have a truly evil, terrifying villain, and so it uses images of dark sorcery and terrifying rituals more pulled out of sword and sorcery novels of the 1920s than any real esoterica in the world. And heavy metal, well, it's there to inspire with fantasy imagery of warriors with swords. You know, it wants to harken back to a more heroic age. It's Wagner opera meets classical music meets rock and roll. And so both often will depict demons and evil villains and ancient Greek gods and that sort of thing. And so both became targets for people who, in the absence of any real satanic threat, needed to invent one. The result of this was that even though there was no credible satanic threat in our culture, and even though neither of those things were actually satanic, they got a lot of attention as if they were. And as a kid, I got a brunt of the aftershocks of the Satanic Panic. When it came to my Dungeons and Dragons hobby, well, students, in the name of God, stole my books and burned them at least once. I had one set of kids actually try and stone me for being a Satanist because I played Dungeons and Dragons. Not to mention a steady stream of rude and harassing attitude from kids my own age. But that wasn't what bothered me nearly as much as the authoritarian side of things. I had a principal in junior high who hated the fact that Dungeons and Dragons was going on in his school. He looked for excuses to punish us. He demanded the kids in my group go to self-esteem and mental health sessions on the sheer basis of the game we played. He confiscated the books of some of the members of my gaming group. He, at one point, when we were having a game and we had a teacher who agreed to split her attention between us and another group she was monitoring, he came in, and the moment he found us unsupervised, happily threatened to suspend us all. It wasn't until parents threatened to call lawyers that he relented. And he's not the only experience I had with people in authority, ignorant of Dungeons and Dragons, punishing me for my interests. The same is true of heavy metal. I mean, heavy metal Keep in mind that some of the great musicians of metal were actually dragged in front of a congressional inquiry into the satanic and un-American influences of heavy metal on the culture. Both D&D and heavy metal were framed for having caused suicide. They claimed that they caused kids to drop out of church. They made all kinds of bizarre claims about what these two things did. And it got up to the governmental level, both in Canada and the United States, in the case of heavy metal. And I experienced trouble for that. I had a couple of guidance counselors decide I was disturbed simply based on my musical taste. I had a teacher give me a stern talking to just for wearing metal t-shirts, which weren't welcome in her classroom. She considered them a violation of the dress code, even though it wasn't specifically written in there. When I was in university, I had an academic advisor, along with the RAs on my floor of the dorm I was in, try and ban heavy metal because I and a friend of mine listened to it. And the times we were allowed to, no other times, just a little louder than they liked. This sort of abuse opened my eyes to a really simple fact. Just because someone's in power doesn't mean they're ignorant. Just because they're in a position of trust doesn't mean they're trustworthy. People can have agendas, they can have false beliefs that dictate the way they use their power, and not necessarily for the good. And so, while it's a small thing to be, when you say are talking about something like Dungeons and Dragons, imagine what the case is about something big, like race or gender. You know, it's perfectly possible for someone in authority to have certain ideas about people of your color, people of your persuasion, and what they're like, that they can use their authority to act upon. Which is why I've come to the opinion if a man wants to have the freedom to choose to live life as he pleases, which we all need to do, we have to give as little authority as possible out to the people around us. We have to focus on our liberties and our autonomy if we are to be able to live according to our conscience and our code. Because you never know what the people in power might really believe. You never know what they might decide is manly or unmanly, or what's right for you or wrong for you. It's only in a state of liberty that you can be guaranteed to be able to decide to be the kind of man you want to be on your own terms. That means making sure that the people in power only have as much as they absolutely need to ensure the safety of yourself and others.